Now I need you to lean in today because what I'm about to share with you ain't just another Sunday message. This is a story that stopped Jesus in his tracks. This is a moment that made heaven pause. And if heaven paused, then we ought to pause too. See, we've heard about Jesus doing miracles. We've read about him healing the sick, raising the dead, calming storms, feeding thousands. But this story right here, this is about a man who didn't shock the crowd, didn't shock the disciples, didn't shock the religious folks. He shocked Jesus. Now let me ask you, when was the last time your faith made Jesus marvel? When was the last time heaven looked down and said, and now that's the kind of faith that moves mountains? We live in a world full of doubt. Religious performance, empty rituals, people talking about God, but not really trusting him. But today, we're going to meet a man who wasn't even part of the in crowd. He wasn't a preacher. He wasn't a church elder. He didn't grow up quoting scripture, yet he understood something that even the most religious folks missed. So I'm telling you right now, don't you scroll away, don't you zone out, and don't you check your watch. Because if you listen close, if you open your heart, and if you're hungry enough to hear, this message could shift your understanding of faith, ignite your spirit, and just maybe God might use your faith to shock the world. Let's dive in. Now let's look at this man, this Roman centurion, because what he did was so uncommon, so extraordinary that it caused Jesus to pause and say something he didn't say often. I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. Now you have to understand how rare that is. All throughout Jesus' ministry, he was surrounded by crowds, surrounded by people pressing in on him, begging for healing, asking for signs, demanding to see something with their own eyes. But here comes a man who didn't need the fireworks. He didn't need Jesus to show up in person. He didn't need to see the lightning or feel the thunder. All he needed was the word. This man came to Jesus and said something we need to pay real close attention to. He said, just say the word and my servant will be healed. Did you catch that? He didn't say, come to my house. He didn't say, lay hands on him. He didn't say, let me see a sign first. No, he said, just say the word. That's real faith right there. That's the kind of trust that doesn't rely on what the eyes can see, but on who God is. Faith like that recognizes authority. It understands power. See, this centurion wasn't a theologian. He wasn't raised in the temple. But he understood something that many folks who had been walking with God their whole lives still hadn't grasped. He said, I'm a man under authority and I have soldiers under me. I tell one go and he goes. I tell another come and he comes. In other words, he said, Jesus, I know how authority works. I don't need you to physically be there because I recognize the authority you carry in your voice. That's what blew Jesus away, not the man's position, not his background, but his understanding of authority. And that's what faith really is. It's recognizing that God's word carries weight, that when God speaks, things happen, that when God commands, the natural realm has to bow down to the supernatural. The centurion believed that Jesus had authority over sickness like he had authority over soldiers. He believed disease had to obey Jesus just like his troops obeyed him. That's not just belief. That's bold faith. And see, that's where a lot of us miss it. Because we say we believe, but we're still waiting to see before we move. We're still asking God to prove himself before we act on his word. We're still putting conditions on our obedience. Oh, Lord, I'll trust you. But first, show me something. First, fix it. First, make it easier, but real faith doesn't operate like that. Real faith says, I don't need to see it because I know who spoke it. Real faith says, I trust his authority even when I can't track his activity. God is not limited by distance. He's not bound by space. He doesn't have to show up in the way you expect for his will to be done. He can heal with a word. He can deliver with a whisper. He can shift the atmosphere from miles away. And the centurion knew that. That's why he didn't invite Jesus into his house, because he didn't need proximity, he needed power. He understood that the word alone was enough. And isn't that what we struggle with today? We want to feel something before we believe something. We want the emotional confirmation, the outward sign, the guarantee that things are changing before we rest in the promise. But God is saying, will you trust me just off my word? Will you believe I'm working even when you don't feel me near? Will you take me at my word even when the house is still broken, the diagnosis still stands, the account is still empty? That kind of faith, faith without physical evidence, faith that trusts the unseen authority of God, that kind of faith gets heaven's attention. That kind of faith is what makes Jesus stop and say, and now that's what I'm looking for, because he's not moved by emotions. He's not impressed by appearances. He's moved by faith that trusts his authority without needing anything else. And I wonder today, how many of us are living beneath that kind of faith? How many of us are praying for Jesus to come down the street, step inside the room, do it the way we imagine it, when all we really need is to trust the word he already gave us, the word that never returns void, the word that holds power to heal, to save, to break chains and open doors. The centurion didn't need a performance. He needed a promise, and that's all it took. Because when you believe in the authority of the one who speaks, you don't need proof. You just need his voice. Now, here's what's so powerful about this story. What most folks overlook is not just what the centurion believed, but how he came to Jesus. See, he didn't approach with pride. He didn't show up talking about his rank, or how many men he had under his command, or how much influence he carried in Roman society. He came humbly. He said, I am not worthy. Did you hear that? Yeah, I'm not worthy. That's the language of someone who understands who they are in light of who God is. Now think about this. This man had status. He was a centurion, a commander of soldiers. He was respected. He had power in the eyes of the world. And yet when it came to Jesus, he laid all of that down. He didn't walk up demanding anything. He didn't try to leverage his position. He didn't say, look at who I am. He said, Lord, I know who you are, and that makes me unworthy even for you to come under my roof. See, humility is the soil that great faith grows in. You cannot have mountain-moving faith while you're still walking in pride. You can't trust God to do the impossible if you think you're the one making everything happen. God doesn't respond to arrogance. God doesn't move at the sound of entitlement. He moves when a heart is low, surrendered, and dependent on him. This man wasn't ashamed to acknowledge his limitations. He didn't try to dress them up or pretend they didn't exist. He said, Lord, I know who I am, and I know who you are, and I'm leaning completely on your mercy. And that's exactly why his faith was so remarkable, because it wasn't just confidence in Jesus' power, it was reverence for Jesus' person. He wasn't just believing in what Jesus could do, he was honoring who Jesus was. A lot of people want the power of God without submitting to the authority of God. They want the blessing without the bowing. They want the miracle without the surrender. But real faith, the kind that shocks heaven, always comes wrapped in humility. You've got to get to a place where you say, Lord, I can't do this. I don't have enough. I'm not wise enough. I'm not strong enough. But you are. That's when things begin to shift. When you stop posturing and start bowing. When you stop trying to impress God and start confessing your need for him. That's where breakthrough begins. That's when faith stops being theory and starts being real. The centurion knew he didn't deserve anything from Jesus, but that didn't stop him from asking. His humility didn't cancel his boldness, it fueled it. Because when you realize you have nothing to offer but still believe that God is gracious enough to move on your behalf anyway, that's when your faith reaches its purest form. You're not manipulating, you're not bargaining, you're simply trusting. And trust that flows from humility is the kind of trust that God honors. Now I wonder, how many blessings have we missed because we came to God with pride instead of humility? How many prayers have gone unanswered, not because God isn't willing, but because we're still too full of ourselves to make room for him? See, God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And this centurion, this outsider, this non-religious, non-Jewish man, he tapped into something that even the religious leaders hadn't grasped. He came low, and in coming low, he positioned himself high in the eyes of heaven. It's not about your resume. It's not about your background. It's not about how many scriptures you can quote or how loud you pray. It's about whether or not your heart is bowed before the throne. Whether or not you recognize that everything you are and everything you need depends on the one who holds all things together. Humility says, God, if you don't do it, it won't get done. I can't earn this. I can only receive it. And isn't that the truth for all of us? We are all unworthy. None of us have it all together. None of us are deserving of his mercy. But when we come to him in honesty, when we come broken, when we come surrendered, that's when grace rushes in like a flood. That's when power meets weakness. That's when heaven says, that's faith I can work with. Because the strength of your faith will never be found in your status. It'll always be found in your surrender. Now here's what'll shake you. This man, the centurion, the one who shocked Jesus with his faith, he wasn't even one of God's people. He wasn't from the house of Israel, and he wasn't a descendant of Abraham, wasn't raised under the law, didn't grow up quoting Moses or singing the Psalms. He was a Roman, a Gentile, a man on the outside of everything religious folk called sacred. He didn't belong in the synagogue, wasn't welcomed in the temple, and yet he had more faith than all the folks who were supposed to be on the inside. Now think about that. Jesus didn't say he hadn't seen faith like this among the Gentiles. He said he hadn't seen it in Israel. That means the ones who had the scriptures, the traditions, the prophets, the history, the ones who should have known God the best, were the very ones missing the kind of faith that this outsider walked in. Sometimes the people who've been around the truth the longest are the slowest to actually believe it. See, that's a danger. Because when you've been in the environment of faith for so long, it's easy to confuse familiarity with belief. You can grow up in church and still miss the power of the gospel. You can know the language, sing the songs, quote the verses, and still not trust God when life starts shaking. And here comes this Roman officer with no Bible training, no religious credentials, no community support, yet he steps up with a kind of trust that heaven had to recognize. It tells me something. It tells me that faith doesn't belong to a group. It belongs to whoever is willing to believe. God isn't looking at who's been around the longest. He's looking at who's ready to trust him the deepest. He's not impressed by your background. He's moved by your belief. This centurion didn't let the fact that he wasn't part of the in crowd keep him from coming to Jesus. He didn't wait for someone to approve him. Didn't ask permission. Didn't try to blend in. He just believed. And that belief turned the heart of God. And you better believe there were folks standing around that day who were shocked. They couldn't understand how someone who hadn't followed the rules, hadn't been through the rituals, hadn't paid their dues, could receive that kind of praise from Jesus. But here's the thing, God doesn't operate off our systems. He doesn't bless based on who we think deserves it. He blesses based on faith. And that ought to bring some encouragement to somebody listening right now. Because maybe you've been feeling like you don't fit the mold, like you weren't raised the right way, like your past disqualifies you from access to God's power. But this story tells us otherwise. This story tells us that you don't have to be born into it to be blessed by it. You don't have to look the part to live by faith. You don't have to be religious to be righteous. All God is looking for is someone who will take him at his word. Someone who believes not because they grew up in it, but because they've come to know him for themselves. That's the kind of faith that opens doors, shifts atmospheres, and stops heaven mid-step. And you know what's sad? Some people have been in church for years and still won't trust God like this outsider did. They've heard sermon after sermon, but their hearts are still hard. They've seen miracles in other people's lives, but refuse to believe God will do it for them. They're caught up in appearances and performance, in trying to look spiritual while walking in fear and doubt. Meanwhile, someone who's never been inside a sanctuary, someone who's got a past full of regrets, someone who was told they don't belong, can cry out in humble faith and receive what generations have missed. God is not limited by our categories. He's not boxed in by our traditions. He's not moved by who we think is worthy. He responds to real, raw, sincere faith. And sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. It comes from people who were never handed a Bible, never taught the songs, never included in the community. But they heard about a Savior who heals with just a word, and they believed. So don't you count anybody out, and don't you count yourself out either, because the faith that shocked Jesus didn't come from the temple. It came from the margins. It came from someone who just dared to believe that the authority of Jesus was greater than the limitations of religion. And that kind of faith is always welcome in the kingdom. Now let me tell you something that often gets missed in this story. The centurion didn't come to Jesus with a casual attitude. He wasn't uncertain. He wasn't passive. He didn't say, well, maybe if Jesus has time, maybe if it's not too much trouble, maybe if he wants to help. No, this man came with boldness. He came with confidence. He came with expectation. He didn't ask if Jesus could heal. He said, just say the word and it will be done. That's not faith that wavers. That's not faith that hesitates. That's faith that moves. That's faith that expects something to happen. Too many of us approach God like we're trying not to disturb him. Like we're tiptoeing into his presence, hoping he doesn't notice all our flaws, all our mistakes, all our mess. But this man came boldly, not arrogantly, but boldly. And don't confuse the two. Arrogance says, you owe me this. Boldness says, I know who you are, and I believe you can. This kind of faith doesn't beg. It believes. It doesn't plead. It proclaims. It doesn't wonder. It expects. This centurion understood something we all need to get deep in our spirits. Real faith doesn't wait for the storm to clear before it speaks to the storm. Real faith doesn't need the whole picture before it starts moving. Real faith takes God at his word and walks as if the promise has already been fulfilled. This man came with a need. His servant was paralyzed, suffering greatly, and yet he had the audacity to believe that just one word from Jesus could turn it all around. That's not passive religion. That's active working, alive faith. Too often we think faith is a feeling. We wait until we feel strong to trust. We wait until we feel hope to move. But faith doesn't wait to feel, it acts. Faith is a decision to trust God's authority more than our own emotions. Faith doesn't need to see the whole staircase. It just takes the next step. That's what this man did. He didn't ask Jesus to come with him. He didn't even need to see Jesus lay hands on the servant. He just believed that the same voice that created the universe had enough power to reach across space and heal with a single command. And that's the kind of faith that heaven responds to. Not faith that needs to be babysat. Not faith that needs constant confirmation. Not faith that retreats when things don't go our way, but faith that stands, faith that moves forward, faith that expects God to show up, not because we earned it, but because we know who he is. That kind of faith doesn't wait for ideal circumstances. It builds an altar right in the middle of the chaos and says, God, I trust you here. When this man said, just say the word, he was declaring, I believe in your authority more than I believe in what I see. And if you want to walk in power, if you want to see the hand of God move in your life, you have to start living like his word is enough. You've got to wake up and pray with expectation. Walk through your day declaring promises, not problems. Speak life into dry places. Believe for healing even when the symptoms are still present. Praise like it's already done. That's not delusion. That's faith. That's what it means to trust a God who operates outside of time, who speaks into nothing and creates something, who needs no assistance to do the impossible, 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 impossible. God is not honored by safe faith. He's not moved by comfortable faith. He's not impressed by faith that only shows up when things are easy. The faith that stops Jesus in his tracks is the faith that says, even if I've never seen it before, I believe you can do it. The faith that says, even if I've never experienced it myself, I trust you enough to speak it into existence. The faith that is active, alive, and ready. Now hear me. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to have it all figured out. But you do need to come expecting. expecting that when you pray, God hears, expecting that when you step, He guides, expecting that when you trust Him, He shows up in ways that exceed your understanding. That kind of faith isn't for the faint of heart. It's for those who are willing to risk everything on the reliability of God's character. So if you're going to believe, then believe all the way. If you're going to trust, then trust Him like your life depends on it. If you're going to walk in faith, then walk with your head high and your heart anchored, not in your ability, but in His authority. Because when you move in expectation, heaven moves with you.